This is the Real Coaching Podcast. This is Joel Filliol, back with Paulo Souza in the new year.
Hi, Joel. How are you?
Not bad. What have you been up to over the New Year's? Did you have 2 weeks of holidays and away from all of your coaching duties?
Uh, yeah, pretty much. But just to send out the message. No, I was working every day, Joel. It was just the grind. No, these 2 weeks are always. I don't like them at all. They just we gain a little bit of momentum in December with the start of the season, and then with the holidays, just that momentum is broken up. So it kind of like makes me feel a little antsy staying at home and the whole holiday thing, which is not really my cup of tea, like you guys say over there. And so it's great to be back in camp and back to work.
Indeed, and I'm off tomorrow. But my favorite thing about this time of year is autoresponders from people that are actually on holidays. Um, Whereas I think real coaching, you don't really get holidays around this time, as you said. Even though the momentum does get disturbed, but family, etc. Right? What are you gonna do?
Yeah. That's well, we're supposed to say that like it's a wonderful time. It's the most
Sure,
wonderful time of
sure.
the year.
Back to work, right?
Yep.
This week we've got a number of questions and comments follow up that we're gonna go through. I've got my own sort of airing of grievances, but a bit of a follow up on some of the stuff that I've posted in the last couple of weeks, and then the main topic that we're gonna have a debate about. We apparently we disagree about this topic, or the content of this blog that I've put up. But we've purposely not really talked about it, so we're gonna have our debate potentially about this top 10 recommendations for Olympic federations. That's the main topic for today. But first, we had a comment that came in via email, and just really thinking about who is this podcast for, really. And I think we addressed this at the beginning about what real coaching is, but I think it's worth revisiting because I think when we're talking about a lot of elite stuff, and even like today, we're gonna talk about some stuff that maybe doesn't apply to the average age group or recreational, or anybody that's listening either is a coach, or you might call serious athlete, but whether it's their full time occupation, or the majority of our listeners, of course, or just athletes and coaches interested in training and performance, but. But this isn't just about elites, and that was the whole point that we had, and I think you summed it up very well. That real coaching is a top down approach. It's learning from best practices of what the top athletes and coaches are doing, and what and how does that apply to everyone, to the wider population, as opposed to going from the bottom up, which is what we see in sort of the marketing driven industry.
Yeah. I mean, just a lot of the work that we do is with the elite athletes, and some of the stuff that it's going to come out is going to be like some people might perceive it as only applying to elite athletes, but again, like we talked about in I don't know, podcast episode number 1 or episode number 2, uh, it's we come at this from a performance based perspective. And so whenever we're talking about our perspective, which is performance based. And I think that uh, coaches of every level can uh, quote unquote learn from it, and also athletes, depending on how performance oriented they are. I mean, uh, anyone could tell me like, well, I'm my expectation for an Ironman is between 12 and 14 hours. But I'm a performance oriented. When we're talking about performance oriented, I like to think that everyone is performance oriented. But how much that performance means to you is going to vary between different kinds of athletes. And definitely when we're talking about performance oriented, then it's towards the athletes for which performance is a big part of their life, or a big part of their goals.
I mean, as you said, like, everyone is performance oriented to some degree. Otherwise, you wouldn't bother going on the start line, right? So everyone is interested in challenging themselves, improving themselves. And because I think some of the perspective that we've got, and I think this is why I know we're hitting the right note. Sort of there's some sense of like, are we elitist, or are we talking sort of down, but I think it's to understand the perspective of where we're coming from, and why that that this podcast has got good resonance and people appreciate it, because we're talking from that perspective of being serious about improving performance and changing performance, and a lot of that is coming from the elite level, but it does apply to everyone that's trying to improve themselves.
Yeah, and a little bit on a personal note, I would just like to apologize. I am sometimes just naturally condescending, and just comes out this way, and I just can't help it. So I would like to apologize in advance to people that feel that I'm condescending towards.
People might not know, but your original I don't know, internet handle or forum handle was the initials SAC. What did that stand for?
I don't recall that. Was that in this century, Joel? I just can't remember.
I don't think so, but you've been accused of being a smartass before. So anyway, keep being you. So but on the next note, related but not really, is I wanted to use our platform here to just talk a little bit about the sustainability of squads like ours, because I think it came up in the Paris ITU conference that I did, that I made a comment that went out on Twitter by some people that were there, and I believe in this, but I think it's the perspective is important to clarify, and that's about the sustainability of these types of squads. And my comment was, federations shouldn't rely on squads like this. The key word being rely, even though we have massive success, and in many cases we're able to provide what federations can't in terms of true independence, in terms of internationality, in terms of environment, and often that's leading to fantastic successes like we've seen in our squads and others. And my point was not to rely on this as sort of a budget option of not needing to develop their own programs, because although it is a great option to exist and we fill a strong niche, I have the feeling in some cases that the prevalence or the success of these squads is perhaps slowing down the development of programs in individual countries, and I think that's not the point of what many of these organizations are meant to be doing, which is to build their own programs. And of course, you can't be a solution for everyone. I've seen that and know that. You're always going to have athletes that for whatever reason don't fit in the central program, but totally relying on squads like this. And my point of sustainability is for us as coaches. What's not happening is a significant investment in what we're doing, and I think that it's great to have the success that we have, but the sustainability part, the challenge there for us is that over the long term, like whether we are not making it too personal about you or I, but whether the groups like this are able to continue going without serious investment from these federations. So I saw that, and that was kicking around in my mind. There was an interview with the New Zealand high performance director Graeme Maw on another podcast that we'll link to, and it got me thinking about that, because I've seen it come up a lot. Oh, look, Joel says that these squads are not sustainable, like it's some kind of almost like a criticism of what we're doing, instead of looking at, well, wait a minute, maybe that is something we should think about, because so many of the top athletes from not in this case not from New Zealand but from other countries are in these squads, and yet there's not a lot of crossover, or the other athletes from these countries typically don't benefit from these environments. So my point is simply that in order for this to really be a long-term solution for countries that either lack coaches, or maybe very small countries with small budgets, they've got to invest in operations like ours and what we're doing, and not simply become so at arm's length that they have nothing to do with us, which is often the case.
Yeah, I would agree with some of what you said. I see this issue with a totally different perspective, where I see our squads being basically personal projects that were started by coaches and evolved into projects involving coaches and groups of athletes, or groups of individual athletes, and the dynamics between the coach and the athletes are going to be more responsible for where those squads are going to go than whatever incentives are out there. I mean, and we discussed this before. If you're doing this because you're expecting rewards from anyone basically involved, it's going to be a dead end, because out there nobody appreciates the work that you do. Federations don't appreciate the work that you do, even if you are helping them, and athletes, a lot of the times, they appreciate the work that you do even only when you're successful. So I think that the sustainability of the squads are going to be more related to persons than organizations, and the dynamic, and that's going to be both because of the people involved, but also because of how those organizations think. So basically, is if I close the doors on my squad and you close the doors on your squad, tomorrow there's no federation out there is going to go like, oh, this is not good for the sport. Everyone's going to go like, oh well, and just move on. So I like to see the issue of the sustainability more from a personal point of view, or a interpersonal point of view, more than how the sustainability interacts with organizations like federations.
There was a good point raised by the moderator at this Paris conference of the panel that Darren, myself, and Sergio Santos sat on, and he said that he asked the question to me, but to the others as well, of whether the federations were a help or a hindrance to groups like ours. And of course, my answer, given the audience as well, I recognize some of that audience is here too. But of course, we have to have good partnerships. But I think the point you make about it being interpersonal and the sustainability is a very personal thing. That often it is a hindrance, these relationships, and I agree with what you said, that they'd if we disappeared tomorrow, I don't think too many tears would be shed, because I think there's a sort of a reluctance, acceptance of what we're doing, despite the success, which calls into question the whole, this whole concept of accountability and drive towards performance and outcomes. Because if we're getting those outcomes, then I'd expect things to be a little different than they are. But I think that's that was my point, my what I wanted to expand on a little bit. I mean, that we could go on and on about that, and I think we will come back to that in the main topic today. But there was a couple of other quick takes that we wanted to cover today. I think USRPT was in the news again. There was something on really the poster boy for this, which is a swimmer that I hadn't heard of before, but it seems that the story just will continue. I think really USRPT is a dead horse already. Looking at the comments of very credible people simply move on. However, there's a great marketing angle on this, and this is that this young American swimmer has turned pro, and his dad coaches him, and and the main story is his unconventional training method. But the whole thing just smacks of marketing, and there's just red flags all over this.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add to what we already talked about. Like you said, dead horse. So yeah. Period.
So I'll put the link in if people want to watch. These things are always interesting from a point of view of these trends that come along, and I think again it's the job of us as coaches is to have very good filters. And there was a tweet going around in the last week about this that I retweeted about the same. It's not for lack of knowledge, but for coaches, it's lack of filter or wisdom to try to figure out actually what makes sense. So,
yeah, I was just going to add that tweet made a really good point, which is it's the lack of filter where a lot of the times, and I would on that tweet, obviously it's 140 words, yada yada, but on that tweet they use the word knowledge, and I would substitute the word knowledge by the word information. So basically, there's a lot of information out there. I would say that there's a lot of information out there, and in order for you to acquire knowledge, then you have to have a filter, and you have to have a very stringent filter, so that only the good stuff is going to turn into the knowledge that you have as a coach.
Indeed. So the other one that you, speaking of Twitter, that you just made a tweet about today was about this New Zealander that's apparently just starting. He's just heard of the Olympics, and he's just starting his Olympic campaign. And this is a character called Braden Currie, who was interviewed on the TRS triathlon site a couple of weeks ago, and there's an article that we'll link to, which says that he's starting off his qualifying campaign. So what's your quick take on this one, Paulo?
Well, looks like Braden is a very good athlete. He just started racing in the Xterra circuit this year, and he's had some really good results. And I think he got second at Xterra Worlds, and so he's a very good athlete. But it's interesting that this story where, well, it does sound like that. It's just like, I just heard that the Olympics are next year, and I'm just gonna take a shot at it. And this story was funny. That I know that there's a headline writer here, but I just found it very funny when it says that he's starting his Olympic qualifying campaign by racing a half Ironman race in New Zealand. So, and the process is proposed as, they're saying that, like, well, if he does well at the half Ironman, then maybe he's gonna get a start at a World Cup, and he's gonna take it from there. So I found it funny because, for the people that are into how the Olympic qualification system works, we know that things don't work out this way. But it seems that for at least for some media, and not TRS triathlon, but for some media, they're willing to buy the story that you just have to do a half Ironman and maybe a World Cup, and the Olympics are just around the corner.
Yeah, I mean, we see this, well, not quite this, but versions of Olympic hopefuls, every cycle, and we know, I mean, it's a good story. People get motivated by this, but often there's not there's more hopes than realities behind them. I think, as you said, Braden looks like quite a good athlete, but it's very difficult to come in late like this, and qualifying as an individual would be extremely difficult given the number of races that remain. He basically has to win everything, which probably isn't going to happen. But as you say, good headlines though.
Yeah, this headline was killer.
So the next point was we wanted to follow up just briefly on polarized training again. I think it's a topic that's definitely inspires interest, and I think the bigger topic here is simply for us in a future show just to talk about planning and periodization, because the the comment that we received starts out by saying, that there's a lot of information on planning and periodization, but perhaps dated for triathlon, perhaps for performance-oriented triathlon dated, and not looking at some of the the newer ideas or protocols like polarization of training, and so I think that could be a show for us to go in deep into that area.
Yeah, we expanded a lot about polarized training. I think that one of the questions that we had was regarding how you always this comes a little bit from some papers, and papers always have a short time span of focus. So the question said, like, well, I always read some stuff where it says like, oh, it's going to be 12 weeks, it's going to be 8 weeks of training and the effects. I think two things need to be mentioned here. The first one is that the reality of high performance sports the world over in endurance is that athletes are going to race very often. Only, for example, in running, in the marathon, is basically like the last sport where athletes are racing very seldom. They have basically 2 marathons a year, and they race some tune-up races, but not a lot of them outside that. But the reality of high-performance sports is that you're racing every month, every 6 weeks, and the training that you're going to do and periodization models that apply to that are going to be what researchers are working on. Except so that's one of the perspectives. Where does the 12 weeks come from, or where does the 8-week focus comes from? On the other hand, when you're using block periodization, or this is a big word, but basically you need to switch focuses every 6 to 8 weeks. And so basically you're not going to be doing strict polarized training the whole year, or if you're going to be using it, you're going to be using different training methods in a periodized fashion.
It illustrates the confusion about this in the sense of, like, you can't just apply polarized training to all 3 sports at once all year. This is what we talked about in the previous episode, and even Louis Delihaye, when he was on, talking about how they progress, and it becomes you might call it less polarized. I mean, it was starting at very little high intensity, almost all low intensity, and then gradually ramp that up, but it's still quite a polarized fashion. So it just shows that it's not an answer that we can just blanket apply. But I think your points about the length of the racing season, I mean, not every athlete or coach listening will have that exact same context, but the switching the focus, I think that kind of approach I think is effective, and you can apply that concept to the build-ups to competitions and to planning your season. I mean, periodization is just a fancy word for planning, isn't it? And planning in a systematic fashion. So you're not necessarily doing everything all the time, all energy systems all the time. Although that is a system, but you might focus on some aspects of often at this time of the year it might be strength or endurance, longer sub race pace type stuff, and then it might become more specific, if you like. That's a format of periodization. Or if you're doing long racing, it might be to some degree it might be the reverse of longer, more specific sessions approaching races. I think the problem that we have with the polarized model is the label issue that I keep coming back to. I don't know if what I'm doing is exactly fits this paradigm, and I don't care either. I think there's something to be learned about it, but I don't worry too much about, well, is what I'm doing fit exactly what this is supposed to be or not. It's more picking out the important concepts, and with this, it's the bulk of your training is low intensity, and a small portion is very high intensity, and perhaps spending too much time in the middle is not as productive, particularly when you're trying to do very high volumes. And if you are going to do your race pace specific work, then you don't need to do a lot of it, or as long. That those are the takeaways that I take. So. No, we don't do it all year round. It changes based on the cycles and the time in between races. You may do different protocols. So I think it comes back to understanding the context that you're working in, understanding the athlete, even the strengths and weaknesses. So, I think in terms of the question specifically, how do you incorporate it into a yearly plan? I think I would come back to those concepts. I incorporate the concepts, not necessarily sticking to a particular ratio, but how can you apply those concepts? When do they make sense? What is the main takeaway there? Is that applicable? And I think it is. I think it has a lot of value, and I think it's why it's resonated with a lot of coaches.
Yeah, the question that we got is, a few questions is, how do you incorporate polarized training in your yearly plan? Do you polarize all year around 85-15 or 80-20? Or do you start slow at 95-5 and end fast at 80-20? Or do you polarize mostly in the off season and become more specific in your training when you come closer to your event? Well, I would answer all these questions with, it depends, and also I don't know. And that's where coaching is comes in. Coaching is also about, it's not just doing Jedi mind tricks with your athletes, but it's also doing some planning and making some decisions. A lot of the times when somebody asks me, like, is it 85-15 or 80-20? I don't know. It's whatever I decide it's going to be, or whatever I think it's going to be a good decision. I can tell you one thing: I never got and analyzed my training and go and say, like, well, okay, we're going to do 2 more minutes of high intensity so that it's 15% instead of 14%. It's not how it works. The way it works is you sit down and plan something and get some guidelines, and then go into breaking it up until you have sessions, or what sessions you want to do. But there's not going to be any formulas. There's not going to be any targets. We don't have, if it's 14% and not 15%, it's going to be fine. I think that we're losing perspective when we are bounded by strict guidelines. And if you're thinking, like, well, there's so much to decide. Well, yeah, that's where coaching is going to come in. You have to make a decision, and you have to make a decision with what you think is going to be best, and then learn from the process. A lot of the times, in my coaching, and I'm sure that happens to you as well, we make a decision in terms of training, and you end up thinking, like, oh, that was not a good decision, And for example, like we talked about, like how last season I did a lot of work on the swim approach that I had, and and eliminated some things, added some things, all that stuff. This year, pretty much I'm using the same stuff that I was using last year. Why? Because I made some decisions. I applied some principles. I came up with a template. I was pretty happy with the results, and I said, like, hey, this is the good stuff. I'm going to use it for this season. So I just want to stress that it's not about the formulas. It's not about if this happens, then I will do that. It's about coaching and making decisions, and this can be applied for the coaches that are listening, but also for the athletes. It's just a lot of times you have to make a decision and then find a way to know if what you decided is had a good outcome or a bad outcome.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the way that certainly I go about planning is not thinking about how what I'm doing fits into this layer of thinking of percentages. It's like, well, what qualities does this athlete need to improve, right? Well, how much stimulus do we need to improve those? How long should we do that for? And and breaking it down in that way. So it's from that bottom up, if you like, of or depending your context, but what do you need to improve, making some decisions about that, how are you going to do it, and putting a plan in place to achieve that. And we know more or less how much stimulus you need to improve various qualities. These things are known either from your own experience, knowing your athletes, or observing or understanding physiology. So we go about implementing that, and I think, as you say, making decisions and according to when the races are and what the athlete's background and experience is. So yeah, I mean it sounds like a cop out in some sense, like, oh, it depends, but there's a lot of truth to that. It does depend, and you've got to make decisions and implement them. So one last point before we move on to the main topic, and that was on we talked extensively about the RPE Session RPE as a way to monitor athlete recovery and performance, and there was a question about how subjective self-reporting on RP. Of course, it is a subjective scale. Athletes make a decision. And the question really was, how does an athlete sort of become in tune with their body, and how do they tell the difference between like a 5 and a 7?
Yeah, I think that the comment from the email was athletes who may not be as in tune with their body as an elite athlete, and I would say that you don't have to be an elite athlete to be in tune with your body and what you're doing as an athlete. For example, right now we're going through this period where mindfulness and meditation are pretty big right now. So this sort of tells you that the concept of being in tune with what you're doing, or being in tune with your body and sensations or perceived exertion is something that's accessible to everyone. Picking up on where we started this podcast, where about being performance minded athletes. If you want to be a performance minded athlete, the first step, in order for you to be better, or to start the process of being better, you can't answer any question. You can't answer questions with "I don't know." When athletes come up to me and say, "Well, I don't know," I've had an athlete saying like, "Well, I asked him like, how does that feel? Is that better?" And he tells me, "Well, I don't know, because I'm not good at it." I tell him, "No, you have to become good at it. That's how the process to be better starts. Is by becoming good at what you do." So when somebody says, how do you know the difference between a 5 and a 7? Well, first off, it's not going to be a big deal if you get it wrong. That's the first thing that you've got to realize. But the second thing is that learn from yourself, and learn to be in tune with yourself. And I think that's one of the advantages of using perceived exertion is going through that learning process of knowing what it means to rate something like a 5 or a 7 or a 9.
Sure. I mean, we talk a lot about self-management being an important quality that athletes have to have, and that's what that means, right? Is making decisions and and I think that the point of these scales also is that it should be fairly intuitive. Despite athletes, I mean, athletes' intuition, maybe they do need to learn, as you said, what those things mean. However, for the purposes of Session RPE, it should be pretty simple, right? And you're not going to make big errors in that way. It's how it was. It's a holistic scale. So, yeah, I mean, I think.
the KISS principle.
Keep it simple. So on to the main topic. So the title of this blog post that I made is the top 10 recommendations for Olympic federations, and I couldn't find the source article for this. I looked all over for the place. I saved it in notes. I think it was post 2012. An analysis of British swimming's. They had quite a disappointing performance at their home games, and although they had quite a lot of finalists, very few medals, and they have an interesting setup, which was Australian performance director who didn't live in Britain, and an American head coach, and I don't know who did this analysis, but I thought it was interesting, and I always think for these kind of points there's both some interesting discussion that can come from it, but also thought provoking in terms of these things are not something that every one of us is involved in, but it definitely makes you think when we're talking about environment and culture, and I think that's what a lot of this was. So these top 10 recommendations that were taken from peers, a lot of them have to do with environment and attitude about certain things. So I thought we would review them in the context of coming into an Olympic year. The very first one is an interesting one, and maybe it doesn't apply in the same way to triathlon, but we'll go with it, and that's point 1, abandon early selections for all but confirmed medal contenders.
First off, this topic came up because I was reading this blog, and I was thinking like, there's a few points here that I don't agree with Joel, and we've had some comments from people saying like, oh, those guys are always agreeing with each other, so that kind of makes things kind of a little bit of dull. So they thought, well, that sounds like a good subject, and point number 1 about abandoning early selections for all but confirmed medal contenders is actually a point that I agree with, where it's important to have the established athletes that are medal contenders to give them the chance of following a long enough process that ends with the Olympic Games, without having to think like, well, I need to qualify, because at that point qualifying becomes more important than actually performing at the Olympics. So for medal contenders, I actually agree that they should have early selections. Everyone else, if they are grinding up until close to the Olympics and continuing the grind into the Olympics, I think that's the best scenario.
And the debate sometimes comes from, well, what is a confirmed medal contender? However, I don't think we'll disagree on that. I think the way that the triathlon's qualification that's driven by the ITU, as it ends in May for in terms of points, it's actually not too bad. It's in terms of timing to reload, but we have seen in the past some of that grind that you allude to, where just these athletes are racing, and I think when you come into some of the selection policies that are perhaps not clear or objective, that are more discretionary, that's when you can get into that situation where the athletes just grind themselves into chasing points and races, and you need quite a clear selection. Certainly in some sports, like swimming, you talk about when you should have your selection meet, and often it's much closer than even we're talking about. But yeah, there's not going to be much debate there. It's only a matter of what medal contenders are, and I think that's an easy one. Is you've won medals before at championships, and at the very least at the top level in the sport.
Actually, the number 2 is one that I would disagree, which said racing tough international competitions far more often, and I would disagree with you here, because, and you give a couple of examples, the French Grand Prix and the German Bundesliga, because I already think that the ITU calendar is pretty populated with races, and I fear that as it is, the athletes don't have a lot of time to do a lot of training in season. so populating their race schedule with even more races, I don't think it's a good decision. What are your thoughts here?
I'm afraid we're not on a good path to disagreeing much here. I mean, I think you're right that we actually have too many races now, and I think in the context of this one, I think about the younger athletes and development athletes doing the right type of competitions to develop. And I think these races, I mean the French Grand Prix and to a lesser degree, but the Bundesliga are great learning grounds for young athletes. In Olympic context, we do less of them. It's my guys. We do less the athletes when we have to make choices. They try very hard to have them not conflict, but as you said, the number of competitions is too many for many athletes, and it's very difficult to improve. So I'm afraid we don't disagree there, but perhaps only on a development level. But then the point of this article wasn't necessarily development, but when we're talking about producing Olympic level athletes, that's when I think these kind of races can be really valuable, especially from non-European athletes, and we see that already. These series are full of Aussies and Kiwis and to a lesser degree Canadians, Americans, Mexicans, etc. now, but way more than there used to be. There used to be hardly anybody from North America or other countries outside of Europe. So
the French. I think the French Grand Prix and the German Bundesliga, they're really good racing opportunities for development athletes. For example, here in the US, there isn't a developmental non-drafting. Well, there's no developmental racing league at all, and a lot of the times when athletes are just starting to be introduced to draft legal racing, a lot of the times racing for U.S. athletes means that they have to do a Continental Cup someplace in Mexico or Central America with a level of competition that's not going to be very in line with international competition. So their opportunities for development are very limited. But yeah, like I feel that in triathlon we already have tough international competitions on a fairly regular basis.
So the next one is perhaps quite a personal one for me, which is interesting because what I've written here is what I've again coming back to the point. Like I've taken the points that were in this article, and when appropriate, I've changed them to make them appropriate to triathlon. But they're not necessarily my points. But I'm going to own this: hire a head coach from your country, make your own people responsible for performance.
Yeah, like. It's interesting that both of us are quote unquote international coaches. I don't even know what that means, but here hiring a coach from your country, I think that there's something to be said about being able to garner some nationalistic sentiment around the athletes, and that's something that, for example, I can't do and you can't do. I can't go out and talk to my American athletes and tell them like our great nation, God bless the United States of America, which will sound a little bit hollow for somebody that still holds a Portuguese passport, and it's not going to work out. So I think that in international competition, there's always going to be a component of my country against your country, and that I think that can be built up in a positive way, and something that can contribute positive for the process. At the same time, hiring a head coach from your country has the advantage of hopefully it will be easier to retain the head coach from your country, and that will have a trickle down effect on making your whole country better by having a head coach that's going to be successful. Many federations all around the world that are hiring internationals, they have the the problem that after the quad is over, or after that person goes and moves on to another job, they have zero ties to that place. So leaving, it's not going to be a problem for them, and nothing will be left from the work of that person. And I think we see a lot of countries out there that when the quad is over, when those people eventually move on to other jobs, they will have nothing to show for the time that head coach was working at a foreign country.
Yeah, I mean, I look at it from a number of different perspectives. One of them is legacy, as you say, like when a coach is finished with a role, even whether you're from working in your own country or not, when the high performance has a lifespan. You don't continue to work at the head coach role or performance director role forever. However, you like to believe you're building a legacy or a program that will continue, that environment, culture, etc. will continue with that person then gone. And in triathlon being a relatively young sport, there's not been a whole lot of international staff movements. We can look to other sports for that. Certainly taken to extremes in European football. I mean, it's the norm. I mean, people are working in all different countries, and there's a huge transfer of knowledge, and it's much different context than we're talking about. But some of that, so legacy, and we see. Again, in some countries, look at Canada. Right now there are not many Canadians working in Canada, and people have different feelings about that. On one hand, you can say hire the very best people. If it's about performance, it's about medals. It doesn't matter what country they're from. However, the point that I took here is I think it's even getting into what head coach means. I might say performance director. More than necessarily head coach, because I think you need good coaches. Almost every country's got the same problem. Hardly any the pool of good coaches, of real coaches, is so small that it's just not enough. So get them from wherever you can, and make sure that you gain something from them. So if they move on, then there's a legacy of knowledge that they've left. Right? They've not just come in as a mercenary, taken a bunch of money, and then buggered off at the end, and you've got nothing for it. Which was to some degree what happened with me, but it wasn't of my own choosing. That was the structure that was in place. However, I think the point of making your own people responsible for performance, that's where the interest of building a legacy, a long-term program is likely to be stronger. So yeah, I think I don't know whether we agreed or disagreed there, but we'll move on. The next point was feed an us against the world culture.
Yeah, at this point here, I just totally disagree. I just feel that the problem with the us against the world culture is that it can as easily become a us against us culture, meaning that if you stoke up the fire of it's us against the world or against everybody else, what happens is that it builds, it's kind of like a anger-based management style that if the world is not in front of you at a particular point, then it becomes us against us. And I think that the us against the world is something that works better in a team environment where it's us, the team, against everybody else. So basically it has the potential to strengthen the bonds in the team as we unite against our enemies. But I think that in triathlon, particularly where it's a totally individual sport, and the athletes are very strong personalities, and there's not a lot of athletes out there with a team approach to things, or a team, even those that are in squads. I think that when you go and think like, it's our squad against the rest of the world, it's going to be very easy for athletes to misdirect their anger instead of at the world, more at each other, whatever. I always feel that that stoking up the us against the world culture is something that will have, like, sooner or later is going to get out of control.
It makes me think of I think it was the psychiatrist Steve Peters, who was famous for working with British Cycling and Victoria Pennington and Bradley Wiggins and others, where he says, emotions have no place in performance, and that said, in terms of consistent good performance, that they have no place because they're unstable inherently, as opposed to being objective and rational. However, we know that there are certain athletes that do benefit, and they need something to fight against, and often they have got a chip on their shoulder for some reason. We know many great athletes that are like that, and I recall with Simon, at one point we had this expression that was 90-10, coming back to our percentages, but it was like do it 90% for the right reasons and 10% for the wrong reasons. And the wrong reasons were somebody that didn't believe you could do it, or that thought that your way was the wrong way, or there was just something that maybe gave you some motivation. And as I'm saying that, it makes me think of Mr. Armstrong as well, who would see negative articles about him in the media, and that would fire him up. And so I think there's something there, us against the world, and we do see. I'm certainly from a squad point of view, I'm not really big on everything about the squad's performance relative to others. I mean, obviously proud of the performances collectively, but really it's individuals that are driving that, and don't feel the need to sort of make it all about the squad. But you do see, when, for example, in British triathlon, they have a successful program, and I think, that the athletes have an identity there, and that might lift everyone, being part of a program, and so perhaps it's not capturing us against the world exactly, but that there's something there about the identity and the ferociousness of the competition. And there's another point about facing the world's best that we'll get to, but that's what I take from that.
Yeah, I would just like to stress that, like, you know me well. It's not that I have anything against negative based motivation, but I think that you can achieve identity within yourself, within your group, without needing an enemy to create that identity. Because the issue here is, if the enemy is removed, then where's your identity? If you only define yourself by being against something, when that something is gone, where's your identity? And a lot of the times, that throughout the seasons or throughout the years, either your opposition changes, or sometimes it's more present and sometimes it's not present at all. I was at the pool today. We did a workout. I'm pretty sure that, like, most of the guys were not thinking about who they're going to race, what races they're going to do, who they want to beat. They were not thinking about it at all. So if our identity is based on being against the world, then in days where the world is very detached from what you're doing, then you have no identity. So that's where I'm coming from here.
I mean, the other, again, this bleeds into another point, but the other aspect of that is remembering that, when we're trying to compete with the world's best, and maybe if we just roll into that point, which is facing the world's best should be your only focus.
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree with this completely. Every day the standard needs to be there, and that's the highest standard, and that's where, facing the world's best, that's the standard that you have to have every single day. So yeah, I would agree with this point wholeheartedly.
And that doesn't just mean, of course, the best guys are running 29 minutes, so I need to do that. It's process based too, right? It's like we're trying to do the best process to move towards the world standard, and not to be complacent or satisfied with the poor preparation, poor performances, or bullshitting or blowing smoke up asses about where athletes are at. And because that's sometimes what we see as well, right? When we totally lose focus on we're trying to be the best in the world and being on that path, but not actually authentically being on that path, right? And yeah, so I mean, we're not going to disagree with that one, and even that has context of where in development too, right? I mean, it's not just at senior or elite levels, but wherever athletes are on the path towards. First of all, they should be on a path towards senior performance, right? It's not enough to just say, "Hey, look, we've got a bunch of great under 23 athletes. This is just magically going to happen into senior athletes." That doesn't work either. We've seen that be propping up programs where you just get fooled into believing that the right things are happening when they're not necessarily. So I think it does apply those standards, facing the world's best in terms of, how do you do that? Well, it comes back to best preparation at all development levels.
But Joel, I noticed that you skipped number 5 here, and number 5 is get the CEO and high performance director out of the way, so the best coaches can be themselves and work in a way they have demonstrated that gets results. But before you answer, I just want to read you your Miranda Rights, Joel. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say or can will be used against you in a court of law. Do you understand these rights that they have been read to you, Joel?
Yeah, I mean that's it's an interesting or one on a personal level, much like the head coach point that we talked about. I mean, one hand we're talking about demonstrated results and process, because often having been in these roles before, there's a desire to manage, and I have to say, and I've been on the other side of that as well, in those management roles. Management of coaches and management of athletes, of anyone, is very difficult. These are skills that take years to develop. Fortunately, most of the people that get drawn into these kind of roles are having to learn on their feet, which is not easy. And on the other side, though, there's a lot of coaches that end up in positions of great responsibility for the program, for the athletes, who also haven't demonstrated results. And so the other side of this is, well, certainly the CEO shouldn't really be involved in a performance level aside from funding, but depending on the scale of the organization, sometimes they are. But HPDs or head coaches, I mean, then you've got to manage coaches, and you've got to be able to get the best out of people, and and if they haven't demonstrated that they can get results, then they have to be working towards that, and equally not become complacent. And knowing that they've got to change. I mean, everyone, every coach before they've achieved success, hasn't demonstrated that. I mean, everyone's been in that place that has ultimately become successful. That there was a point where they hadn't demonstrated it, but then it comes back to good processes. Are we doing the right things, and not in a bullshit checklist kind of way that often ends up being the case, but in real authentic ways of helping, managing towards the best practices of developing people, developing athletes, and that's communication. It's understanding and observing what you're seeing. It's being able to make decisions. It's all of those elements.
Yeah, I'll be fully exercising my Miranda rights here, and let's move on to point number 8, which I think is really interesting from a coaching point of view. Point number 8 says focus on the athletes to succeed, and this is I'm sure you've come across this question, which is, when you're operating with a squad, you always have athletes that are succeeding, athletes that are not succeeding or doing not as well, and the age-old dilemma is, should you be focusing more on the athletes that are succeeding, or should you be focusing more on the athletes that are not succeeding to bring them up?
Yeah, sure. I mean, and that's a challenge at many levels. I mean, we see where this goes wrong in many cases, again, when we're talking about program perspective, is maybe you're fortunate to be involved with a country that has maybe a medalist athlete or a medal potential athlete, and if that's not managed well, you find the development programs just drop away and disappear and become underfunded because the focus is so much on those performers. But equally within a squad, right? Because sometimes the squeaky wheel gets the oil, and and often those are athletes that are struggling, that are having challenges, and maybe who aren't the best performers, and yet you have to make those decisions about where do you put your energy, where do you put your focus.
Yeah, I think that there's two aspects here. Obviously, when the context of this blog is more like on program wide and focus on the athletes to succeed. I feel that a lot of the times, and particularly like federations through the funding that they provide, a lot of the times they open up too many loopholes in that athletes that either have been on the pipeline for a long time, or athletes that some people believe in, even if they haven't justified that belief yet. A lot of the times, those loopholes undermine the rest of the program, because if you have an attitude of saying like, okay, we're going to focus on the athletes who succeed, and then at the same time you're going to creating special cases for the athletes that are not succeeding, then the whole focus on the athletes who succeed is just not going to be there. And so when you say focus on the athletes to succeed, I think that this should be followed, and this should be, ruthless and fair across the board. And a lot of times I feel that you focus on the athletes who succeeds when it's good for you, but then you open up special cases for people that in your eyes are just like special cases, and that undermines the standards of the whole program.
Yeah, I mean, I can't disagree with that. Coaches that have worked in the Olympic pathway, I'm sure can identify with points from that. Whether it's with your own athletes or just observing programs about the special cases. That we often see. In observing other countries as well, that they may appear to have very high standards. To start a World Series, you've got to win a World Cup or some such criteria, and then you're watching the athletes that are competing in the World Series, and you're like, but these guys haven't won World Cups. What's going on here? And et cetera, et cetera. I mean, we've all seen this. So the high standards apply when it's convenient, and I think this is again a challenge, because having been involved in these programs, we also know that we sometimes these criteria get written, and I've been involved in writing them. And you, at the end of the year, you the criteria to fund athletes or to select athletes at various levels, you don't end up with what you thought you would, and because an athlete's been injured or ill or for whatever reason, and the quote unquote right athletes aren't being selected, so the criteria is bent or massaged in such a way that you end up with what you wanted, which is sometimes problematic. And what you're saying, being ruthless about it, you can get away from strict accountability. And I think often when those rules or criteria are bent for athletes, it's at their disservice that we're doing that, because we're saying, it's okay that you didn't perform, or you didn't achieve what you needed to, and that's fine. You can still move up through the system. When at the senior level, that doesn't really work that way. And what kind of culture, what kind of behaviors are we trying to reinforce? Is there the fire in the belly, which is another point? Is that there? Is the desire, or are we just sort of this middle upper class sport of privileged athletes, and taking the funding and just sort of, hobbyists? Is that the kind of culture we're trying to have, or are we trying to be about performance? And, when we're trying to be the best in the world, that those words have to mean something. And, if we are massaging the situations into being what we thought they should be, then, when you're on the other side of that, that doesn't look too nice, even if you can rationalize it quite well on the inside.
The next topic here that I think that was the one that I felt was like I disagreed completely with it. It says put your athletes in situations where they are not well paid, not well housed, not comfortable. Those will fire. Those with fire in their belly will rise. Same with coaches. I couldn't disagree more with this. I feel that having this stoic and kind of like low rent approach to high performance, I don't think it's going to make anyone better in the sense that I can't agree with management styles that go towards enslavement of athletes or employees or whatever we're talking about here to become better. I read this and I'm thinking at the same time that the CEO or the high performance director are traveling to races and in business class and staying at the Hilton. Athletes and coaches can stay at Motel 6 and fly coach. I just can't agree with this way of seeing things.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective, because we do see that, particularly with all of the IAAF stuff now and other sort of federations and sort of the Blue Blazer Brigade, flying first class in 5-star hotels, et cetera, and then the athletes, the only ones that don't actually make any money really from the Olympics. I mean, there's lots of money going around, but it's not going to the athletes, is it? But
yep.
I think the point here is more sort of cultural. On one hand, I always enjoyed a bit of the struggle, and I thought that from my perspective, we don't need the first class treatment, and I think that's coming back to that point a minute ago about what sort of motivates or drives athletes, or are we trying to be the best in the world? And we see these athletes that become entitled, or coaches as well, and they're living the lifestyle. And this that happens at the Olympic level. And you might think, oh, well, Olympic athletes, people listening, ITU athletes going to the Olympics. So there's a good percentage of athletes that go to the Olympics that are really living the lifestyle. They're doing enough to be selected, doing enough to be getting on funding, doing enough to keep in the system, but they're not driving to be the best in the world. And there was an interesting point. I think it was on. I will try to find the link to this, but it was on the Hammer Media site. This website is about run by Hammer, throwing coach and athlete. But there's a lot of good content on there, and I've linked to it before. And it was contrasting sort of the difference between Western athletes and I don't know who the other group was. We'll call them Eastern, or maybe it was sort of I think it might have been sort of Russian coaches coming over to the U.S. early on. And the observation was, Western athletes seem to be motivated by being successful, meaning that they were able to buy a nice house, a nice car, big television, etc. And the culture where this coach had come from was, we want to win medals, we want to be the best in the world. And that's what that point says to me, is where is the motivation coming from? What are we trying to achieve? And if we have too much of the situation of we feel, oh, we've arrived, and we see this sometimes in facilities, I wonder if there's somebody should study this, the sophistication of the various sporting facilities that you have, if there's not a negative correlation with actual performance. And we know, in some respects, you see these beautiful gyms, and they've got alter Gs, and they've got woodways, and they've got endless pools, and they've got all, recovery rooms, et cetera, and there's no athletes training there, no success coming from. And of course it doesn't, it's not a black and white situation like that, but there is something culturally about knowing what you need to actually be successful. And I mean, that was a big theme of our second episode, talking about what are the essentials of high performance. So I think we came at this from different views, but perhaps actually don't disagree in the end.
But yeah, the thing here is that the whole thing about not being well paid, not being well housed, not being comfortable and succeeding, it kind of like fits a little bit of a Western civilization fantasy that we have, that if we could make our life simpler, we would be better, and it's just that a fantasy. It's kind of like, when athletes go to Kenya to train because only by being exposed to poverty they can be thankful for what they have, and that ends up being a Western civilization fantasy. I think that from my perspective, I want to be well paid, I want to be well housed, and I want to be comfortable if I earned that, if and the way I earn that, or in the way the athletes earn that, is by being very good. Of course, that there's a lot of entitlement out there, and for example, like, I think that a big reason why you've had a decline in performance from the Australian system or the New Zealand system is that athletes feel that they've made it just because they get to spend the summer in Europe, and that's making the team is enough for them to think that they have arrived. But I don't fit into this fantasy of if I bear down, if I go to the absolute minimum, then I'm going to be more successful, because the bottom line is that high performance is going to cost money, and athletes, in order to perform, you can bet that if they're well housed and they're comfortable and they're well paid and they're happy with the way they're living, while at the same time have a culture that's towards earning what you have and towards performance, and not towards entitlement, that's the best way for high performance to happen.
It contrasts a bit with the the marginal gains. Team Sky driving around to every race with fresh beds for all their athletes, and staying in the 100,000-pound motorhome and that sort of thing that we saw, as opposed to the Rocky Balboa approach.
Yeah, which again, Rocky Balboa, is that a movie? Sounds like a fantasy to me.
Sounds like a fantasy. Maybe it resonates with me because I'm not well paid, housed, or comfortable, and I want to be better.
Yeah, that's probably, yeah. Well, that you're just like throwing it at me so that people are listening to this just like, well, Paulo's got it all. Is like independently rich, so I can see. But no, that's not where I'm coming from.
So the last point, which got some response on Twitter, I think, because I chose this quote to tweet out the blog, which was reward top performance, not effort. At the end of the journey, some will fail. Tough. Agree or disagree?
Yeah, I would agree. I would agree completely here. I think that again, this blog comes at a perspective of like a program or an organization, and the bottom line is that organized sports are organized to achieve top performance, not effort. Let me tell you that whatever federation you have, whatever Olympic committee, they're not funding anyone to follow their dream. They're not funding anyone to find themselves and their place in the universe. They're not there to support you to follow the process. They're there to reward top performance, not the effort that you're putting into it. And the way you as an athlete or a coach interact with that's going to be your personal decision. But from an organization point of view, they're there to reward top performance. And I think that should be made clear. and then people make personal decisions that's going to fit that ethos, and obviously some will fail. I remember a long time ago you said about an athlete saying that everybody's on board for success, but not a lot of people are on board for failure, and that's interesting in a high performance context, when at any point of the process we are so close to failing, because by definition we should be pushing very, very hard, and if we're pushing very, very hard, then we're very, very close to failure. And it's interesting how, and it's a little bit of it's the way our brains are wired, where we're always thinking about like the possibilities in failure, in success. We're never thinking about the possibilities in failure, but failure is part of everyday life.
Sure, and I mean, and most fail. I mean, you could argue that not everyone has the same ambition or same goals, but in this context we're talking about, which is high performance, which is competing with the best in the world, very few are achieving the outcome that everyone aspires to. There's only one gold medalist, and everyone else, by that definition, has failed. And to some degree, I think any medal at a games is very special, coming from coaching of a silver medalist. However, when you get to the point where you contend for medals, you want to win, and that in that case everyone else are the losers in that case, and I think I like the way of thinking about being prepared for that in many ways, and from a learning point of view it's much more potent if you're authentically looking at what happened, and where your expectations met and not, and why, and in a blameless kind of way. When I reflect on, this whole thing makes me think of in 2006, we went to the Lausanne World Championships. Simon and the Canadian team, and we failed pretty bad, and we had terrible World Championships. And but I think the reason why then we went on to success in Beijing 2 years later was because of how we went through that process. And in some sports organizations, you'd sack everybody and there'd be huge change. But in that case, there was a good analysis of what went wrong. There was a change of behavior, but we kept the fundamentals that were good and built from that. And so sort of taking that process that in that case it was very, very, very powerful and necessary to embrace failure in the right way. And but the bigger point here, I think, beyond the idea of learning from your failures, of course, is that high performance is tough. It's hard, and few will be successful, and you got to be okay with that. You've got to be totally committed to the process of being successful, and the other side of that is accepting the pain that comes with failing, and it is tough. And that's the point. And if you don't care enough, you're not committed enough, then your chances of being successful are also reduced. And in your point as well, of course, it's not about effort. Everybody tries hard. It's irrelevant.
Yeah, absolutely.
That was the article. We've been through the points. We'll link to it in the show notes if people are have different opinions or want to add their 2 cents. Email us, podcast@joelfilliol.com, or reply on Twitter to when we tweet out this show. Interested in hear different perspective, and again, bringing it back to where we started of how all of this discussion applies to all levels of athletes and coaches. This context of this article is about high performance and federations. However, all of us are operating programs that are coaches, and and even a single athlete you can consider, like our conversation with Dan Lorang about Jan Frodeno. I mean, he had a team and a program around him. He has a team and program around him in the same way. So everyone has a program around them, and therefore principles on which to base what they do and how the decisions they make.
Mm-hmm.
So no races to talk about this week. So wrapping up, how are the triathlon squad donations coming in?
Yeah, it's been really good. We've had a good season of donations and already mailed a few of the squad gifts and have a few more squad gifts to mail this week. And yeah, it's gonna be helping us this season, mainly taking care of our pool costs for the whole year. So that's gonna be very helpful. And I want to thank everyone that have donated and just remind everyone that you can donate at any time. So if you just listening this and you have this urge to give us your donation, then yeah, just do it.
On my end, I'm doing a few Skype chats with people, coaches and athletes. So email me if you're interested in that. If you want the ebook version of Real Coaching episode number 1, sign up to my mailing list and you get an auto respond with a link to that. We'll put that out. And I think we've got a few more reviews, but if you want to help spread the word of the Real Coaching podcast, then give us a review on iTunes. Tell your friends.
Yeah, even that person that sent us that nasty email, I would encourage him to go on iTunes and give us a review.
I put a list of some of the products that we were talking about in the swim myth busting episode. It's on my website, joelfilliol.com/resources. If you want to just have a quick link, kick over to Amazon to order some agility paddles, or if you can't be bothered to make your own band and you want to pay $5 for a company that made one, you can do that. We get a small kickback from that, but it's really just to show what we're talking about. We had a few questions about parachutes, etc. Not everything is available everywhere, but
You can buy $100 parachute too.